viewers, wishing everyone the best and welcome to my channel. For today's video, I'll be covering the decade from 509 BC to 500 BC. My goal with these videos is to give everyone an overview of the time period as a whole, to get a sense of what was going on throughout the world. By showing events through this lens, I hope that it will broaden your understanding of the historical period we cover. Today, we will be covering a critical time in ancient history, focusing on the Romans, Carthaginians, Greeks, Persians, and Chinese, respectively. Famously, it is known that this decade encompasses the separate formation of the republics in Rome and Athens. Surrounding this, we will also see Roman contacts with Carthage and how the Persians interacted with the Greeks. And to end the video, we will discuss what is occurring in isolation within the Chinese region. Despite the isolation seen in this period, their eventual interaction will impact both societies profoundly. When looking at East and West, I have always found interest in the parallels between the two. There is something interesting in seeing how these two isolated regions developed in such similar but also different ways. With that introduction, let's dive in. In the year 509 BC, Rome entered the decade in a tumultuous position. They have lived under the reign of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus since 535 BC and have had enough. Superbus ruled in a callous manner with a tyrannical tendency, and the event known as the Rape of Lucretia would bring it all crashing down. The name Superbus in Latin roughly translates to the proud or the arrogant in English, which kind of gives you a sense for the kind of ruler that his subjects saw him as. The Rape of Lucretia, which occurs in 510 BC, occurs when Sextus Tarquinius, the son of Superbus, meets the daughter of the prefect of Rome during a party. Depending on the account, a night or three later, Sextus enters her bedroom and rapes her. Now, this definitely depends on the account you read. If you read Livy, you'll get one thing. If you read other sources, you'll get another. But I'm just kind of giving you the gist of the story. She goes to her father the next morning, tells him what happened, and commits suicide right in front of him. This horrifying scene forces a group of leading citizens, headed by the legendary Lucius Junius Brutus, to ask the patriarchs of the city to depose the king. This is highly summarized, but that is essentially how it went. The vote is quickly decided, and the decision is made with a solid majority to depose the king. The king during this time is away on a military campaign when he hears the news. As Brutus is headed that way, Superbus immediately leaves the camp and heads for Rome. When the leaders in Rome do not allow Superbus back into the city, he leaves in disgrace, exiled from his former kingdom. Following the exile, the Roman Senate would create a new system whereby two consuls would be elected every year to run the government. By now, we're in the year 509 BC, and the very first consuls would be Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who expelled Superbus, and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia. During the reign of Brutus and Collatinus, the Tarquins attempted to conspire against the government and take back the throne. When the plot was discovered through a slave of a conspirator, they were all killed, which would include two of Brutus's sons. Following this tragic event, Superbus would lead an army from the Etruscan cities of Veii and Tarquinii to take back his kingdom. Brutus led the army to defend Rome successfully, but in the aftermath he would lose his life. This battle would come to be known as the Battle of Silva Arcia. In 508 BC, while this is all playing out, Carthage and Rome would sign a treaty with each other over trade and expansion. This treaty essentially declared where Roman traders could conduct business and where they could not, in exchange for guarantees that the Carthaginians would not expand north into Latium. The main purpose of this was to prevent Romans from trading in North Africa in the sphere of influence of Carthage, and in return, the Carthaginians would leave. In 505 to 504 BC, Rome was engulfed in internal conflict with the Sabines to her northeast that ended in Roman victory. The Sabines are very famous from the rape of the Sabine women initially when Rome was founded. So the Romans and Sabines always had an interesting relationship, being neighbors, but also culturally different at the same time. So basically the Sabines not taking part of the deposition of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, they found a reason to rebel and see if they could strike it out on their own. In 503 to 502 BC, Rome would suppress another revolt in the towns of Palmyra and Cora in Latium. These towns were located to the southeast of Rome, and this is where Latin and the Latin languages comes from. With the Sabines causing alarm to the Roman people in the aftermath of the Latin revolts, the Romans appointed their first dictator, Titus Larchius, in 501 BC. As tensions settled, he bequeathed his power to the electorate, setting a noble precedent for the role of dictator in their republican society. The role of dictator is extremely different than how we would see it now. Dictator was appointed for a short period of time based on the event, but it was basically used so that a ruler could stay continuous within a major conflict. For example, is FDR, when he decided to run for re-election despite the two-term precedent. That would probably be America's closest version to a Roman dictator, where the people decided that FDR could continue despite the precedent set by George Washington. To finalize the region, we conclude the decade with Carthage capturing Gadir, present-day Cadiz, on the southern tip of modern Spain. This begins Carthage's expansion into Europe. And on that note, we move to Greece. For the Greeks, the decade will begin in a similar fashion to the Romans with the formation of a new government. The shift in government began in 510 BC, when the Athenian people would depose the tyrant Hippias with the support of Spartan troops. Following the successful revolt, Spartans installed an oligarchy that favored their interests. 2 years later, in 508 BC, a statesman by the name of Cleisthenes would return from exile following an Athenian revolt against Isagoras. Now, Isagoras was part of the Spartan oligarchy that was installed once Hippias was deposed. So that is why you see a clash between Isagoras and the Spartan-favored oligarchy and Cleisthenes, who would get support from the middle class. During his rule of Athens, he instituted democratic reforms, changing the way people were represented in government. Previously, representation was based on the 4 leading families, but this was changed to a geographic-based representation system called demes. And that's where the term democracy comes from, is the representation of demes. Cleisthenes made 10 demes in total with equal representation to make sure that power was segregated amongst the population. The reforms that Cleisthenes undertook would eventually lead him to be considered the father of Athenian democracy. During the era of reform, Athens' fragile democracy was at risk of a Spartan war following the deposition of Isagoras. This led Cleisthenes to make a grave mistake. In order to dissuade the Spartans from invading, Cleisthenes sends an appeal for help to none other than the Persian Empire. And with that, we can now welcome the Persian Empire into our overview of the decade. It is unfortunate, but not much written record exists of the Persian Empire during this period. If I had to guess, he was primarily consolidating power within his government through the satrapy system. They had just conquered Egypt in the prior decades. They had just expanded into Anatolia, Thrace. So once Thrace was captured in the 510s, we don't really hear much until the Greek revolts that would occur starting in 499 BC. It is primarily thanks to the Greeks, though, that we have this account of the Persian Empire for the time period. In 507 BC, a year following Cleisthenes' rise to power, ambassadors from Athens were sent to the capital Sardis in the Achaemenid satrap of Asia Minor to meet with Artaphernes, brother of Darius I. When the ambassadors asked for Persian assistance, Artaphernes had no idea who the Athenians were. He had never even heard of this group of people before. The Persians did not know much across the sea. They were primarily a land-based empire, so their interactions with the Greeks were primarily based on the merchants. You don't really have a lot of government interaction. So in order to receive his assistance, the ambassadors were required to offer water and earth, the Persians saying for submission, complete and utter submission. The ambassadors decided to accept the request with the fear of Sparta in mind, and in doing so, Artaphernes would additionally request that they restate the tyrant Hippias to power or face invasion. Hippias. Upon their return to Athens, faced with the two options available to them, either instate Hippias or face the wrath of the Persian Empire, the ambassadors would be stripped of their duties and the government denounced any deal made by those ambassadors. And this will come to haunt them in the not-so-distant future. 5 years later, in 502 BC, the wealthiest Greek island at the time, Naxos, entered a political period of turmoil when they disposed their aristocratic rulers. These aristocratic rulers appealed to the tyrant of Miletus, miles east of Naxos on the Anatolian mainland in 500 BC. Miletus is on the very southwest coast of Anatolia, so Naxos isn't too far away. It'd be one of the first stops they'd make once they get closer to the mainland. The tyrant, Aristagoras, currently paid tribute to none other than the Persian Empire. Wanting to expand territory and please the Persians, but not having a capable army, Aristagoras appeals to none other than Artaphernes, the same man who the Athenians had submitted to. Artaphernes was convinced, so upon the approval of troops from Darius I, they began preparations for the attack on Naxos. This event will spark the Ionian Revolt, where you see a lot of the cities founded by Ionian settlers a couple hundred years before this would all revolt at once. All of these cities along the western coast of Anatolia that were primarily Greek speakers and part of Greek culture that would lead to none other than, as everyone knows, the movie 300 and the Battle of Thermopylae. Okay, moving on. So we're going to finish the video today with China. And when I talk about China in isolation, I generally mean that in the context of the West, outside competing kingdoms and other urban entities, they just didn't have like other competing cultures. The Koreans weren't fully developed. Japanese were still undergoing a lot of migration. You'll see the Yayoi period, I believe. So East Asia, except for China, is very developmental right now. So this is what I mean by isolation. And the reason I bring up this isolation is because it has a profound impact on their society. During this period, there was little pressure from neighbors and no urbanization anywhere close to what the Chinese had achieved. Because of this, much of the strife and division is within the borders of Chinese civilization. Now, in the later centuries, you'll start to see northward pressure from the Mongolians and the Yuezhi. And so, during this period, there was little pressure from neighbors and no urbanization anywhere close to what the Chinese had achieved. Because of this, in the decade of 509 to 500 BC, the Chinese were near the end of what is now called the late spring and autumn period. This period is marked by the erosion of dominance of the Eastern Zhou dynasties and their grip on local rulers. This would create a power vacuum replaced by many minor kingdoms competing to acquire land over their rivals. So basically, you're seeing these local warlords, typically heads of dominant clans, and the 5 dominant competitors were the Chu, Jin, Qi, Qin, and Wu. The biggest event of the decade occurs in 506 BC when Helü becomes king of Wu. In the year he takes the throne, he decides to mount an offensive against the state of Chu to the west. Now, Wu is on the northeastern side of China, certainly south of Beijing, closer to Shanghai, still in that northern Chinese area, and then Chu would be directly to the west. The author of the famous book, Art of War, Sun Tzu, would lead the campaign alongside King Helü. Sun Tzu is extremely famous since the 1920s in Western culture. He was a leading general for the Wu during this late autumn, spring period. War was ever constant for the Chinese at this time, and Sun Tzu really expressed war in a very delightful manner, discussing the topics of strategy, including human will and how humans act based on different events. So knowing when to retreat, when to push forward, when to set traps is all detailed in The Art of War. And once Sun Tzu would lead the campaign, the Wu invasion force would clash with the Chu army at the Battle of Boju, where general and brother to the king, Fu Gai, will lead an offensive against the will of King Helu and rout the Chu army with minimal casualties. Following the catastrophic defeat inflicted on the Chu army, King Helu goes on to capture the capital at Ying in swift order. The Chu royal family escapes and makes an appeal to the Qin on their northwest border. The Qin are located in modern-day Xi'an, so in that very northwest region, right along the mountains that separate them from the nomadic tribes. Once the capital of Ying is taken, the Chu family escapes and makes an appeal to the Qin. The Qin decided to help the Chu army, and as a combined force, win decisive victories to reclaim much of the Chu kingdom. The defeats caused General Fu Gai to be sent back to the capital of Wu, where Fu Gai declares himself King of Wu. And this just goes to show the Game of Thrones aspect within these competing periods for different states. Men are always competing for power because when there's only one head at the top, all it takes is one uprising, one assassination to upend the entire government and claim power for yourself. So this is very common. When King Helu hears this news, he has to abandon the capital of Ying and return to the capital Gusu in Wu. King Zhou of Chu is reinstated in Ying, and Fu Gai resettles in the Chu kingdom once King Helu returns. So once King Helu returns, he immediately forces Fu Gai out of Wu, and which is very customary at the time. Fu Gai is exiled from the region, and none other than the Chu are willing to accept his exile. Because, in all honesty, without Fu Gai, the Chu would never have reclaimed the capture of Ying, or they would have recaptured it with heavy casualties. This period of time also coincided with the life of Confucius, one of the most impactful people within all of Chinese culture and history. He's still a household name today. Almost everyone in Western countries even has heard of his name. If you were to mention the name Confucius, everyone would have some sort of idea that he was a Chinese philosopher. He became governor of the city of Zhongdu in 501 BC, starting his political career before becoming famous. Confucius was still a young man at the time, figuring his way in life, and through connections, he had been able to gain this post of governor. And what would happen is he would basically come to despise politics and would lead a life of teaching, learning. And with that, we come to the end of the decade for each of these great societies. From the fledgling Republic of Rome to the conflicted autumn and spring period, civilized society is an era of constant expansion, and the rulers are playing the Game of Thrones. I appreciate you taking the time to watch my video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, share, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.